Okay, so we're going to talk about overhead variances now. So my total, it should be total variable overhead variance is my actual variable overhead minus my standard variable overhead rate times my standard hours. Now, I want to specify here and kind of make a note of it that this says standard hours because that is the activity base they chose to use as their driver for the variable overhead. But really, this amount here, this standard hours here, would really be whatever they chose as their activity driver. If it's machine hours, if it's whatever it is, that's what they would use to find my overhead variance. So actual variable overhead plus minus standard variable overhead rate times my standard hours. So just like with our materials price and usage variance and my labor rate and efficiency variance, we have two different types of variances that make up this total variable overhead variance. And that is my variable overhead spending variance and my variable overhead efficiency variance. Now my spending variance measures the aggregate effect of the differences between the actual variable overhead and the standard variable overhead rate multiplied by the actual direct labor hours. So we got the actual hours times my standard variable overhead rate, and we subtract that from what my actual variable overhead was. So this is basically measuring whether we spent too much, and with our rate, I guess more accurately, whether our rate was correct or accurate when we estimated our rate in the first place. The efficiency variance is whether or not we use more or less hours than we would have anticipated based on our volume. So the efficiency variance is actual hours minus standard hours times my standard variable overhead rate. So this one, we're really measuring whether our rate is correct. This one, we're measuring whether our hour estimate was correct based on our standards. For fixed overhead, we have a total fixed overhead variance, which is our actual fixed overhead minus our applied fixed overhead. And our applied fixed overhead is our standard hours times our standard fixed overhead rate, which would be that predetermined overhead rate or that plant-wide overhead rate generally. And then again, we break that down into our spending variance and our volume variance. So our fixed overhead spending variance is, did we spend more than we anticipated on our fixed cost or fixed overhead specifically? So that's our actual fixed overhead minus our budgeted fixed overhead. Our volume variances, what was the change, or if there was a variance, was it due to the fact that that the quantity that I used was different from what I anticipated? So we have our budgeted fixed overhead minus our, in this case, standard hours. And again, let's say again, these all say standard hours because they're using direct labor hours as their activity driver, but it could be a different activity base. So all that matters here is that we're utilizing whatever activity base we use to find the standard rate in the first place would be how we would make sure to measure that. And like I said, the examples just give standard hours, but it could be, direct labor hours, could be machine hours, could be whatever we use to allocate it. So the volume variance is our budgeted fixed overhead minus our applied, and our applied is based on our standard number of hours times our standard fixed overhead rate.